Hello, and welcome to Fraudulent Strategy, a white-collar forensic podcast series in which we explore the myriad ways that financial crime, corruption, and misconduct can derail strategy and cause havoc. I'm Scott Moritz, president of White Collar Forensic, where we assist clients and their outside counsel in managing their response to white-collar crime, money laundering, and bribery incidents, assist in the pursuit of financial recoveries, and help fix the things that were exposed as broken along the way. Thank you for listening. I think for a lot of us, when we think about crypto, it still makes us cringe a little bit. And the question and the topic of today's episode is, should it still make us cringe? Whether you're a fan or you're shying away from it, the crypto ecosystem is expanding rapidly. Part of what is causing many to spurn crypto is due to reputational issues. These include the prevalence of crypto-themed fraud and vulnerability to hacking, which make many retail investors uncomfortable and are keeping some people away. And at the same time, crypto adoption is expanding, and the regulatory and enforcement environment has become more favorable to business. This confluence is opening increased opportunities for innovation, but it's also creating opportunities for a wide range of fraud schemes, ranging from meme coin scans to sophisticated market manipulation. And some of the most egregious examples of crypto fraud, they continue to be addressed by law enforcement, and rightly so, but civil enforcement by victims and other private parties is equally important in addressing crypto fraud and holding crypto criminals accountable to their victims. It's also important to remember that criminal investigations' primary objective is to punish those responsible, whereas making victims whole is secondary and certainly not a foregone conclusion. Civil litigation can really fill that void by seeking recovery for victims of things like pig butchering scams, crypto project rug pulls, and institutional investment schemes such as those involving crypto startups that failed to execute. Joining me today are Tim Traynor and Arlo Devlin Brown, the co-founders and managing principals of Traynor Devlin Brown PLLC. Tim started the firm after 17 years as a partner at Sidley Austin, where he served for more than 10 years as the global co-leader of the white-collar defense and investigations practice, which was ranked number 2 in the world by Global Investigations Review in 2024 and 2025, until his departure from the firm at the end of 2024. Before Sidley, Tim served for nearly a decade as a federal prosecutor and senior unit supervisor in the Office of the U.S. Attorney for the Southern District of New York. Before co-founding the new firm with Tim, Arlo Devlin Brown was a partner in Covington Burling's white-collar investigations practice. Arlo has been ranked in Chambers and Partners for 5 years in litigation, white-collar crime, and government investigations. And in these reviews, they highlight his client skills, calling him an excellent lawyer and exceptional. As a federal prosecutor, Arlo received some of the most prestigious awards offered by the Department of Justice, including the Director's Award for Superior Performance and the John Marshall Award. Arlo is a seasoned litigator and trial lawyer who's built a national reputation representing global companies and prominent individuals in high-stakes government investigations and complex litigation. As a leading securities fraud prosecutor and public corruption chief at the U.S. Attorney's Office, also in the Southern District of New York, Arlo secured landmark victories that transformed industries and recovered billions for fraud victims. His signature achievements include recovering a record $1.7 billion for victims of the Bernie Madoff Ponzi scheme. Along with Tim Traynor, Arlo helped spearhead the DOJ's enforcement campaign against illegal internet gambling operations, resulting in more than $3 billion in penalties and industry-wide reforms. So welcome, Tim and Arlo, and thanks for joining me today.
Thanks a lot, Scott. I've become a fan of your podcast, and I'm pleased to be a guest on this episode.
Yeah, first-time listener, first-time participant, long-time listener. So it's exciting for us.
Well, thank you for invoking WFAN there, too. So before we get into the main discussion, I think part of what our listeners may find intriguing is how former prosecutors with long careers as white-collar crime litigators have kind of changed course, and whose work now includes representing victims of crypto fraud schemes, amongst other things, which I think is pretty unique. Can you explain what's different about the work that you do on behalf of the clients of Traynor Devlin Brown?
After 17 years at Sidley, I really felt like it was time for a change. I look at the arc of my career as having different chapters, and I was ready for some new challenges. And I've always felt more comfortable being on the offensive side, whether it's playing sports or in the courtroom. We wanted to incorporate not just some of the defense work that we do, but also a lot of sort of plaintiff side civil litigation advocacy into what we do. I thought it would give us an opportunity to do some things that are more meaningful. Not that the stuff that I did on the defense side wasn't meaningful, but when you're fighting for somebody who's lost a lot and whose life has been impacted, it can really be a motivator and drive you. And so I was looking to get back on the other side of the V a bit and to fight for some folks. And looking at the cryptocurrency space, I'd done so much traditional financial services fraud and money laundering, and also done some significant crypto cases, and thought that this was an area that I would be able to make an impact, and also that would just make for a very interesting practice.
Well, I think you're right. I mean, it's such a rapidly evolving area. Like in so many advances in technology, it takes a little while for the law and for case law to catch up. So I think it certainly will make for some interesting client matters for you guys. So at the top of the episode, we talked about how many individuals and institutional investors are still shying away from cryptocurrency as an alternate form of payment or investment opportunity. So what types of crypto fraud are you seeing in your practice that people should be aware of?
With all the current enthusiasm around crypto and the reporting about successful investment opportunities, what we're actually seeing a fair amount of right now is both individuals and companies getting ripped off through either sophisticated scams and or in some cases hacking types of operations. For individuals, the real problem we're seeing is so-called pig butchering schemes. And these come in various forms, but it starts with someone reaching out on LinkedIn over some sort of messaging platform, sometimes claiming to have some connection to the person. And then it can either go in a direction of possibly a friendship or romance developing, or possibly opportunities to work from home to make some money. But then at some point, there's a request to deposit funds into a crypto wallet as part of the way to make money. And usually the money on paper grows and the person then tries to withdraw it, right, to make sure it's really working. They're able to withdraw it. And then the scammer encourages them to put more and more money into the platform. And then, of course, at that point, once they're really in, it becomes impossible to withdraw and excuses are given. Sometimes they're told to pay taxes or some other fee. But ultimately, we've seen people, including financial professionals, very sophisticated people, lose 6,000 and 7,000 figures through these scams, and it's heartbreaking when we hear this. We're helping people work with law enforcement to try to make recoveries, and in some cases, you can do civil actions. But there's also, frankly, a lot of people we just can't help due to the nature of crypto. I think people should tell their family and friends about these things, to be very, very cautious. For companies, we're seeing something in some cases that's similar to what individuals are experiencing, where a smaller company and including some sophisticated companies have been seeking loans or other investment opportunities and told they need to put some funds into a crypto escrow. And then sometimes through various manipulations of the crypto wallet keys, the funds are just stolen. There's been a couple cases like that. But I think the more interesting thing here that we're seeing with companies is a broader interest in investing in crypto projects and potentially a more willingness to litigate when these projects fail. Because there's been a long sort of inglorious history in crypto startups of promises of sort of developing very innovative blockchain payment systems and other projects that have attracted funding from investors in this space. And sometimes the investors are taken for a ride and the founders are not really building much of anything, and they find a way to issue some token and manipulate the price of it and cash out. And what we had been seeing in the prior administration was a lot of reluctance by companies to pursue these claims where they've made these investments. And I think that was because there was a concern that sort of putting your hand up, even as a victim, on a project that the SEC might view as being securities related could land you in trouble. And so there'd been a sort of more insular way of dealing with these failed crypto investments in the prior administration. But I think as things are going more mainstream, we're starting to see, and I think you will increasingly see more willingness by investors who have lost capital on these projects to pursue civil and even criminal actions against founders who are cheating them.
Thanks, Arlo. The DOJ and the SEC under the current administration have certainly taken a pro-business, somewhat more relaxed regulatory enforcement stance on cryptocurrency. So what can we expect to see in this current environment with the removal of many of the what have been regulatory barriers that may have inhibited the growth of crypto?
The aggressive approach of the last administration really is gone, and the new administration, for anyone who's paying attention to the cryptocurrency space, has seen the new administration take a very different approach to enforcement in the area of cryptocurrency. The DOJ, for example, has stated in writing as a policy matter that they are no longer going to regulate by prosecution. They're not going to pursue cases that are strictly regulatory. Things like unregistered securities, unlicensed money transmitters, failure to have an effective AML program, things like that that are viewed as sort of regulatory crimes are not really going to be the focus for the DOJ any longer, but they have expressed the fact that they will continue to go after crimes with significant victims, bad actors who are engaged in real fraud. I think that folks should take the DOJ's word for that. I do think we'll see a very significant decrease in enforcement simply because there'll be less areas that will be pursued, but the true victim crimes still will get attention from the department. SEC is a little more complicated. They have also dismissed a whole bunch of enforcement actions that were regulatory based and have professed to be taking an approach that is much more focused on rulemaking and less on enforcement. They are going to collaborate extensively with the CFTC, which will have some jurisdiction over the crypto industry. And so I think as a general matter, enforcement will decrease at the federal level. It has decreased and will continue to do so. As Arlo has pointed out, that gives rise to opportunities where there are issues that are unaddressed for civil enforcement to take a role here. And also, I think, things are cyclical. And so, and the crypto space has been no stranger to fraud crimes with significant victimization. And if the environment is too unregulated, there's a risk that we'll see an uptick in fraud activity. I don't know that I can say that that has happened. The crypto industry has been on a pretty solid upswing over the past year since the new administration came into leadership, and it's usually in a downswing when you get to see a lot of misconduct exposed. So right now it's sort of unclear how this is all going to play out. We also haven't seen much in the way of rulemaking, some, but not much by the SEC. So it is unclear how that will sort of supplant for the enforcement that was setting the rules in the past. So I think it's interesting times. And I think if you're in the crypto industry in any capacity, really important to pay attention to what's going on, both in the Department of Justice, but even perhaps more important with the SEC and the CFTC.
It certainly feels like we're on the precipice of like a big growth trajectory for crypto, and in the much wider use of blockchain as a means of authenticating the parties to transactions. So it's interesting stuff is certainly on the horizon. I think it's there's so many different iterations of this combination of the current administration's pro crypto stance and more selective regulatory enforcement of industry participants. Some may see this as like an anything goes environment, but that probably doesn't comport with reality. So what types of prosecutions and enforcement actions should we expect to see over the next few years?
I think the people who think anything goes are going to be in for a rude awakening, even in this administration, putting aside, what happens beyond that. And that's something you often see in white collar related areas anyway, right? There's a boom in something, there's a relaxation of rules, and then people sort of test limits and then they go over lines. That's just a pattern that's as old as time. So Tim is right. What you're not going to see, right, is these DOJ prosecutions of simply sort of regulatory type offenses. They've made that clear. They've said that in their policy statements. There's not going to be any more cases of, this crypto exchange doesn't have a great AML program. We're going to bring a criminal action for failure to have an adequate AML program or failure to file a SAR. You're not going to see it. You are going to see fraud cases where there are real victims getting hurt. And as I mentioned before, pig butchering is a huge problem. It's really stunning. Tim and I have both commented the number of calls we get and the number of emails, despite doing no outreach really in this area. And I think the DOJ is going to have to find a way to tackle that. There's transnational organized criminal rings that are behind a lot of these pig butchering schemes. There's actually essentially work campuses in places like Cambodia and Myanmar that are factories where these scammers have call centers. I think you're going to have to see action on that. The other place where I think you're going to see action is really interesting. And I think you're going to see a shift in the industry's views towards the SEC and CFTC, because there's obviously been a great deal of, at best, skepticism of the SEC in the crypto space and a lot of, real animosity. And so the idea that the crypto industry is going to be pushing the SEC to enforce rules may seem very unlikely, but I think it's going to happen because you've already had the stablecoin bill pass. You're seeing positive prospects for a market regulation bill. And with or without new laws, the SEC is putting guidance in place and making rules. And you're going to see, I think, a lot of companies start complying with those rules. And those rules are going to have costs and burdens. And they're going to look around to other companies that are not complying with the rules, exchanges that are skirting new regulations that are being put in place. And they're not going to like that. And so I think you're going to have pressure from the industry of, now that you've made these rules and we have people who are complying with them, you need to go after those who are trying to get around them and hurting the law-abiding industry. That may take a little while before that happens, but I think that's where you are going to see the SEC and CFTC really get back into the game at some point.
It's interesting that like a FINRA potentially kind of springing up, or the industry participants maybe stand up a self-regulatory body in the absence of meaningful regulatory enforcement. Most organizations, they try to look out, 5 years on the horizon, take a, long-term strategic planning, and then try to put in place, milestones to achieve their financial and their growth goals. And at the same time, compliance programs and internal controls are designed to align organizations with the legal and regulatory requirements that govern all companies, those operating in regulatory industries, of course, and then publicly traded companies who, by the nature of them being publicly traded, are regulated entities in that context. So what should organizations be doing in anticipation of a return to kind of an increased regulatory enforcement that may occur with the next administration? Because it's if it's part of your long-term strategic planning, it's going to overshoot the 3 years that remain of this administration.
This is a really important point. Right now, we're in a period of time where the administration is encouraging innovation. And some of that is great, but along with that may come growth that is, where you have players in the industry who are, facilitating the wrong market participants, folks who are engaged in fraud. And, the sort of regulatory rules haven't been fully written, and, enforcement of regulatory offenses is off the table for now. So if you don't have obvious victim crimes, you may not really feel like you're, exposed to all that much risk right now. But at the end of the day, somebody's going to have to, the administration or the agencies are going to have to get serious about businesses that are coming into the U.S. marketplace and are facilitating fraud to the extent that does happen. I think it's important for market participants to be really scrutinizing their risk profile. Take a look and be honestly self-critical about your own business, understand where it is that you may be facilitating misconduct, and figure out how you're going to, identify that conduct, address it, prevent it, mitigate those kinds of risks. Because at some point, there are going to be regulators who are going to become active, as Arlo sort of emphasized in his last response. And you want to be ready for that. We have seen this January how quickly a new administration can turn on a dime and take a new approach to the crypto industry, and that can happen going the other direction. So to be thoughtful about what your risk profile is and how you can mitigate that and create a business that is an honest business and is sustainable as an honest business is important. And that's especially important given that so many of the big cryptocurrency industry participants are now seeking to access the U.S. marketplace. It's the biggest crypto marketplace that there is, and a lot of the businesses operated outside of the United States. It was tough for agencies to get a hold of them, and so they didn't feel like they had to be accountable. But folks are now getting more and more entrenched in the U.S. and wanting to see rules written that will allow them to operate here the way that they want to operate. And that's great, but it is going to cause them to be more subject to jurisdiction in the United States. So we may have a turn in approach. We may have a greater ability in the United States to get jurisdiction over some of the market participants. And all of that can add up to enforcement activity against companies that aren't minding their risk profile. There are all kinds of different elements of an effective compliance program from a money laundering or anti-fraud perspective. Those are sort of traditional elements of a program. And folks should know sort of generally what those things are, understanding who your customers are, understanding their transactions, understand the risk profile of the people who are using your services, and putting in place controls that are going to both identify those risks and mitigate the negative repercussions that can come from those risks.
It's not just being in good stead for your next regulatory exam. It's just good business, right? It's protecting your shareholders. It's protecting your customers. It's having, a control environment that is tailored to your unique risk profile, because you will run a more profitable business if you get those things right. The bonus is, of course, when you do have a regulatory exam, you'll probably fare pretty well. It's a proven business model also that if you get your internal controls and your compliance programs right, you're gonna reap a financial benefit in the long term. It may cost you some money to get it stood up, but once it's in place, you're going to become a more resilient organization.
Yeah, I think we're seeing that exact point play out with some of the crypto exchanges, which, many of them were operating outside of the United States and were less focused on compliance and risk mitigation, and now are accessing the United States and don't want to be known as sort of facilitators of fraud. They want to have reputations for doing a business the right way and attracting customers due to that reputation. That requires a commitment to compliance that maybe wasn't there before.
I'm glad to hear that compliance is not falling out of favor. That's how I spend my day. So, stablecoin, they're interesting because they're a form of virtual currency that isn't as volatile in terms of its value, and because it's tied to a specific fiat paper currency, such as the US dollar or the Japanese yen. Stablecoin legislation and the market structure bill will put rules in place that limit fraud. It should limit fraud and encourage all kinds of new participants in the crypto economy, which should help with adoption. As we talked about earlier, creating opportunities for new market participants will also bring unwanted market participants and expand the potential victim pool and create opportunities for fraudsters and transnational crime groups, such as those that are involved in pig butchering schemes, which are horrifying. Mainline industry players will certainly, you can expect them to comply with regulations, but you're going to get others who want to take advantage of the market interest without following the rules. And that's likely where we're going to see the emergence of new scams and an expanded victim pool. So what do you think of some of the new legislation, such as the Genius Act? What does it mean in terms of recovering money for victims of crypto-themed crime?
I think the Genius Act is absolutely a positive thing. There are debates, of course, about how dominant stablecoins will be, what the market will look like. There are debates about whether the Genius Act should have contained these provisions or those, and whether it's fair to various players in the industry. But from uh, a fraud perspective, it's just a positive. Whenever you go from a situation where you're operating in an environment where, which we had been, where you're counting on stablecoin providers to just do the right thing when it comes to help people recover or work with law enforcement, from that environment to one where they're required to do so, and there's rules of the road for how they do so, it's just a great improvement. The Genius Act contains some very positive provisions here. It requires stablecoin issuers who are going to do business in the United States to have the ability to freeze stablecoins wallets. If a criminal is identified as having a stablecoin, that they can essentially just block that person from accessing that wallet with that stablecoin in it, and they're going to have to comply with court orders, both law enforcement and civil court orders, to return funds and things of that nature. You have had some actors. Circle, I think, has been a really positive player in terms of its engagement even before this legislation with law enforcement in particular. But now you're going to have these rules apply to everyone, and there's going to be clarity around it. And I think that'll be phenomenal. Some of there's regulations that have to be worked out, so we'll have to have a fuller assessment once that regulatory process is done to see sort of what the BSA AML compliance requirements will be for stablecoin issuers. And it's interesting because they're going to have to know their customers, and they're going to have to be able to block terrorist financing transactions, but they're not banks, right? It's a much more decentralized regime. So we'll have to see how that all translates. But I think it's a positive. To the point you made about bad actors taking advantage of this, I think you will see that. I think the sort of enthusiasm around stablecoins, you're going to have people issue coins that seem like they're protected and regulated, but are in fact not. So I think people, you still need to have a kind of buyer beware mindset out there. But this is really a positive.
I think I've used the word explosion 3 times in this episode, but it's apt for this next part of the discussion. There's been an explosion of growth of a new type of automatic teller machine, and it's just one of those who could have foreseen this type of things, in which you can convert paper currency or electronic funds into virtual currency. And my question is there a legitimate business purpose for a cryptocurrency teller machine, or are they simply an enabler of elder fraud and pig butchering?
Well, there is, theoretically a legitimate function for crypto ATMs. They provide, convenient means for people to exchange US dollars, typically in the United States at least, for cryptocurrency. But of course, you're correct that crypto ATMs have come up and been featured in a number of fraud schemes. And what they do is they enable folks to very easily exchange, US dollars at the crypto ATM for cryptocurrency, or they can reverse. You can scan your wallet and trade cryptocurrency perhaps at some of these ATMs. They're very often used in fraud schemes because they're, typically you're transacting with somebody on the other side who's anonymous, and the cryptocurrency that you think you're purchasing can be gone in seconds and be irretrievable. So there have been all kinds of schemes where, the scammer will convince somebody to go down to a store on the corner and deposit a whole bunch of cash because they need cryptocurrency for some purpose, and the cash is just gone. It's the transaction is never consummated. It is an issue that has come up. I think a lot of states are taking a look at regulating crypto ATMs. There really hasn't been the kind of regulatory regime that perhaps should be in place until now. The issue is getting some attention because of the number of times it's come up in crypto schemes, fraud schemes. But coming back to your initial question, The business case for a crypto ATM is perhaps a challenge to really fully understand, but theoretically, yes, there are legitimate uses for a crypto ATM, but lots of red flags.
You think in terms of people investing in crypto, like you'd expect maybe a more legitimate seeming setting, in the lobby of like your private banking institution as opposed to um, freestanding in a convenience store or the vape store. I'm going to go out for a pack of smokes and I'm going to exchange my paper currency for crypto while I'm out. It just seems a very unlikely venue for these things if they're not for a legitimate purpose. I was looking at some of the litigation being brought against some of these crypto ATM operators, and in one state AG suit, I remember reading 96% of the transactions that they looked at were the proceeds of fraud. It seems high.
Yeah. Unfortunately, there is sort of no shortage of warning signs that folks won't drive right past without paying regard to, and it's why some of these scams that may seem pretty obvious to most folks are still successful. I think that's a big component of having a cryptocurrency network environment that people can trust is also folks just becoming more sophisticated and educated about the risks and thinking critically about the things they're being asked to do or the options that are being proposed to them.
Yeah. I mean, so much of successful fraud schemes is creating a sense of urgency in the victim. You're going to miss this opportunity if you don't do it within this timetable. And then it gets probably replaced by just standing in front of the crypto ATM trying to figure out how it works. And you're maybe not using enough of your brain to sort of step back and say, is this a good idea? Because you're now, consumed with trying to figure out how to get this thing to work. But yeah, just horrible iteration of the many different iterations of crypto frauds that are out there. There's so much of the frauds involving cryptocurrency actually have very little to do with crypto, so much as they are seeking to tap into this subset of unsophisticated investors and their belief that there are fortunes to be made investing in crypto and mining cryptocurrencies. What advice do you have for people who are considering venturing into a crypto investment for the first time, including maybe steps that they should take to kind of vet potential investments and who and how they should report someone they believe are trying to defraud them, or perhaps if they've already been defrauded? What would you guys recommend there?
I'd say a couple of kind of cliches apply, but one is if it seems too good to be true, it probably is. That's where you're seeing people sometimes get tempted with offers they're often complicated sounding, right? But they just seem too good to be true. And the second is do some research, right? If there's some opportunity pitched to you and it involves Coinbase, it involves some US regulated entity, and that's where the money goes and the money stays, that's a lot safer and more reassuring than something which may have a fancy website, which anyone can generate, or a cool, URL, but is not a company that's registered in the US or there's much history on. Because even if it's not a pure fraud scheme, just sort of good luck finding regulators to help you or get your money back if it's not a US licensed platform. So sometimes the pig butchering clients come to us and I've, asked Chat GPT or gone into Google with the names of some of these investment platforms, and they say pretty quickly it's a fraud. And you got to do that at the outset because there's a terrible self-defeating part of human psychology at work in these things too, which is once you've gone far enough into it, right, and you've put enough money in, it's incredibly hard sometimes to convince people that this is really a scam, and they keep putting money in because they just can't let themselves admit that they've already lost so much. So you got to do this at the outset.
On the too good to be true theme, I think one of the challenges is that in some ways, cryptocurrency has been too good to be true because, if you bought Bitcoin 10 years ago, it's incredible how much that's increased in value. And folks see that and they think that that kind of thing might continue and they want to get in on it. So there actually is a foundation for believing that there might be an opportunity that is too good to be true. But, that kind of thing is not likely to continue. The The advice that Arlo gave does apply. Really, at this stage of the maturity in cryptocurrency market, folks should be really scrutinizing things that do seem too good to be true. And you have to approach it, there are really two major functions for cryptocurrency. One is to store and move value, and the other is as an investment. And if you're approaching it as an investment, you really should look at it as you would other investments, like investing in stock. You have to understand what it is that you're investing in, what the risks are to that investment, what the upside you want to know, and be very thoughtful about what your thesis is for your investment. Don't just grab something because it's liquid or semi-liquid and you can transact in it and offload it if it doesn't work out. That's not honoring the sort of type of discipline that you need to have when you're approaching your investment portfolio. So it's really being educated, and again, being both critical of things that are proposed to you and self-critical about your own motivations and whether you're being careful enough when you approach an opportunity.
Tim's absolutely right on that. I mean, there are people who have gotten very lucky and made a ton of money on crypto in its earlier days. But if you're investing in something, doesn't matter if it's crypto or anything else, you have to approach it seriously like an investment, or there's just a tremendous risk you're going to get hurt in a way that was beyond the sort of risk you accepted when you took it on.
Well, this has been really informative, and it was also great hearing about the work that you guys are doing at Trainer Devlin Brown, and I'm so happy to hear that the firm's going well, and I look forward to continuing to hear about its growth and your successful advocacy on behalf of your clients. So thank you both for joining me today.
Thanks,
Good to
Scott.
be here.
Spending some time with you.
So that was Tim Trainer and Arlo Devlin Brown of the law firm Trainer Devlin Brown. This concludes this episode of Fraud Eats Strategy. I'm Scott Moritz, president of White Collar Forensic. Thank you for listening, and stay tuned for the next episode of Fraud Eats Strategy. And in the meantime, if you have an idea about a fraud or corruption case, topic, or guest that you'd like to hear about in a future episode, email us through our website at whitecollarforensic.com or at info@whitecollarforensic.com. Thanks for listening.